I have now run 3 D&D 5e campaigns that have gone from level 1 all the way up into the high levels. My Hand of Light campaign ended at level 20, my Sword Coast Guard campaign ended at level 17, and currently my Ancient Dragon campaign that I run for my patrons is at level 18. So I can tell you from first-hand experience that there are reasons that most people don't play D&D at high levels, besides the simple fact that most campaigns fizzle out after a few game sessions. And I can guarantee you that Wizards of the Coast game designers know this too. The real question is, are they going to fix these problems with the new edition that's not a new edition that they're releasing in 2024? Number 1, it's exceptionally hard for game masters to create balanced encounters and adventures. First of all, volumes have been written on how bad the challenge rating system is. Encounter balancing using the challenge rating system begins to become more difficult around level 8, and it's mostly useless after level 12. At that point, you're really just guessing. I mean, I may look like I know what I'm doing to my players, but that's just my poker face. I'm actually living a life of quiet desperation as a game master in high-level play. The thing is, when creating encounters at higher levels, unpredictability can cause encounters to be unintentionally deadly or anticlimactically easy. I've had it happen that a party easily handles an encounter that is 4 times deadly, then at another time nearly TPKs to an encounter that was like a moderate challenge. I crap you not, it is mind-boggling to see this happen. Furthermore, the magic items a group has access to, or not, can make encounters trivial or deadly, as can simple things like, did the group gather information about the foes in advance or not? Were they prepared? Let us not forget either that a single spell can significantly change the threat level of the encounter. The Force Cage spell, for example, can take a dangerous melee combatant, even something like a Dracolich, out of a combat because they don't have access to teleportation magic, drastically changing the threat level of the adventure with a single action. And we're not even talking about the slew of other high-level spells players and monsters might bring to bear. Arcane Eye, Dimension Door, Teleport, Legend Lore, Power Word Kill, and of course, Wish. Sometimes spellcasting at high levels just comes down to who has more counter spells, because the first spell to get through is going to be devastating. Number 2, high-level spells and abilities ruin the fun of the game. Alright, story time. In my Ancient Dragon game, my players inadvertently unleashed 3 servants of the void. They call them hags, from a jar where they had been imprisoned for hundreds of years. And naturally, these hags began doing evil stuff, principle of which was beginning a process that would see the entirety of the dark shards consumed by the void. A not so good thing. However, my players have access to the Wish spell, actually several different wishes via magic items that they gathered, and they were discussing the idea of just wishing the hags had never been released from their jar. So as the game master, I was faced with the time-old conundrum. Do I somehow twist their wish about so that it doesn't do exactly what they wanted and complicates their lives even more? Or do I let it work, thus undoing hours of my game prep? In other words, do I nerf the spell or allow it to invalidate all my hard work? And the irony of the whole situation is that if you analyze it from the meta, if they just wish away the hag problem, they are literally just skipping that part of the game. They would be noping out of the adventures that were planned along that storyline. So it rather feels like it would be a lose-lose. They don't get to play the game, and I, as a game master, wasted a bunch of my time preparing those adventures. Which begs the question, why do it? Now, you might say, well, Luke, maybe they didn't like that storyline and wanted to do something else. And that's fair, but let me say this. Up until that point, they had been presented with this basic storyline. There are 9 evil overlords that must be defeated, and they had been going from one to the other, just clearing out the dungeons and killing the overlords. Now, after a few adventures doing that, I was thinking we need to shake things up a bit because it's probably getting monotonous for my players. Thus, I introduced the quandary with the Servants of the Void. So, I would argue that this new twist was probably more exciting than just going back to taking out the overlords. At any rate, my players did not use that wish, much to my relief, and it's rather a moot point. I kind of lucked out, I guess. And that's just one example of how spells and abilities can break the game. Break the game. Invalidating GM work and arguably making the game less interesting, in part because they allow players to win without really playing the game. It's like a big skip button that they can just push. Another example of this is if the game master plans a series of encounters only to have the players teleport past them. Then the players enter the final fight without using any significant resources, turning a challenging climatic battle into a non-memorable sweep. This also, by the way, can make the GM feel like they just wasted hours of preparation, because they kind of did. However, besides the whole issue of the skip button, there's another general issue with high-level spells. Although players love using high-level OP spells on the bad guys, they often hate it when the GM uses the same spells on them. For instance, the Force Cage spell can take a major monster out of the fight, which makes players feel awesome, I guess. However, if a player's beloved barbarian is completely neutered by a Force Cage, it can ruin an entire session for that player. You see, players don't like their character being useless and then just sitting at the table watching their friends play any more than the Dungeon Master likes his monsters being completely useless. It is a double-edged sword that cuts both ways, simultaneously making the game less fun for both players and Game Masters. Well, you might say, the Game Master just shouldn't use those spells on the player's characters then. And you're right, Game Masters probably shouldn't. However, where does that leave the GMs? Holding the bag, that's where. Doing the prep work, facilitating the game for everyone, and then getting screwed when their monsters are just wished away, force caged, banished, plane shifted, and the like. That hardly seems fair now, does it? Well, you might say, the Game Master could just add more monsters or take measures to counter those spells. And you're right, of course, but then we're delving into the territory of invalidating characters' spells and special abilities, which just takes us into another problem. Frankly, the only real solution I've found as a Dungeon Master running high-level D&D 5e is a truce, an armistice between Game Master and players that no one is going to use spells or abilities that ruin the fun for the other side. Otherwise, we find ourselves in an arms war with the losing side not having any fun. Number 3, the game is too easy for the players and too hard for the Dungeon Master. 5th edition D&D is designed such that characters are incredibly powerful, and in the higher levels become invincible superheroes. Now, yes, while being awesome feels well, awesome, when there is no challenge in the game, many players find that unsatisfying. It's not that they don't want their superpowers, it's more that they want the encounters and adventures to present more of a challenge. However, that can be exceedingly difficult for Game Masters to pull off. First, most monsters aren't strong enough to challenge high-level characters. Less than 10% of the creatures in all the 5th edition monster books are CR 17 or higher. And even high CR monsters fall flat and will get whomped on unless they have 4 to 5 minions with them. Now, I can tell you though that with experience, you do figure out how to get around this and craft challenging encounters using the creatures in the books. However, the new Dungeon Master who thinks they can just stick one CR 24 monster against 5 level 17 characters and have it be challenging just because the challenge rating calculator says it's a deadly encounter is going to be sorely disappointed, because every experienced Dungeon Master knows that the PCs are going to kill that monster in just a couple rounds without breaking a sweat. So I really feel for new DMs who have to deal with this. I bet that this probably makes them prefer low-level play, don't you think? Furthermore, the issue of the game being too easy for players and too hard for the Dungeon Master to run is compounded by the issue of high-level spells that we just discussed. I mean, everything just starts to add up after a while. By the way, did you know that Lair magazine is now on Foundry VTT? That's right, you can get our Pathfinder 2nd edition and D&D 5e Adventures and Monsters in Foundry all set up and ready to run. Save yourself hours of prep time with pre-made walls, dynamic lighting, tokens, and journal entries for the entire adventure. We've basically done all of the setup for you. You just just install the adventure or adventure arc and it's ready to run. You can get our Lair magazine Foundry modules by becoming a DM Lair patron or by grabbing them off the DM Lair store at the links below. Number 4, there isn't much published content for higher levels. Wizards of the Coast has published 3 adventures for parties over level 15, and only one of these, Dungeon of the Mad Mage, is a cohesive adventure from low to high level. The other 2 appear in collections of adventures, Candlekeep Mysteries and Tales of the Yawning Portal. The upcoming Planescape set is supposed to have an adventure for level 17 characters, but that, again, doesn't seem to be part of a larger adventure. What this means, of course, is that dungeon masters who don't want to homebrew their own adventures are crap out of luck. So you might be asking, why doesn't WOTC publish more high-level adventures? Well, I'll tell you why, but it's probably different than what they'll say if asked the same question. I suspect that the official reason is something like this. We've done surveys, and the majority of players say they enjoy low and mid-level play more. Therefore, we are just giving players what they want. And my counter to that is to ask, why? Do you think players enjoy low and mid levels more? Could it be because the higher levels, say after 12 and certainly after level 15, are mostly unplayable for the various reasons we've been discussing in this video? Now, I think the folks at Wizards of the Coast are very smart people, and they undoubtedly know this. What they also know is that designing adventures and modules for high-level play is extremely challenging. After all, how do you design an adventure for a game master to run when the players could do any number of things with their powerful abilities and spells that cause the GM to have to throw out practically everything in the adventure and improvise on the fly? Now, I'm not knocking improvising. What I'm saying is that when a game master buys a module, they want to be able to use it, not just have to homebrew everything anyway. If you look at some of the old school modules and even some modern day ones, they acknowledge the game-breaking nature of many of these spells by specifically banning them in the adventure. Of course, they may not have banned them outright, but they put story reasons into the adventure that make them not work. In Ravenloft, plane travel just doesn't work. Why? Oh, because the dark powers, that's why. Certainly not because plane travel would make escaping Ravenloft trivial and invalidate practically the entire module. Certainly not that reason. Number 5. The incredibly low chance of character death makes combat less thrilling. At higher levels, death is rarely permanent. If a character somehow manages to die, which by the way is nearly impossible by itself, they're resurrected again before anyone bats an eye. As long as one character with a raise dead spell survives a near TPK, or one character who can load the bodies into a cart and haul them back to town, the entire party will most likely come back. And if most of the body is missing, well, there's always reincarnation. Which brings up a fun fact. For my in-person group, we have an ongoing joke about whether or not a character has a do not reincarnate bracelet on or not. It's in part because some players would rather just roll up a new character than risk their character coming back as a species they don't want to play, or one that breaks their build. I think it's pretty stinking interesting, but not everybody feels the same way. I've made entire videos about this, so I won't belabor the point. But in combat, risk equals reward, and a game with no risk is boring. Most board games have a way to win and a way to lose. A game where you can't lose isn't exciting. Competitive sports are popular because fans want their teams to win and they don't want to feel the agony of defeat. Well, the same thing applies to TTRPGs. By the way, if you're finding this information useful or have experienced the same issues in your games, please give me a thumbs up and let us know down in the comments what your experience with high-level D&D gameplay has been. Number 6. Combats are a slog at higher levels. Anyone who has played high-level D&D can attest to how long combats often take. It isn't unusual for a combat to take 1 to 2 hours at the game table. If it's a boss fight, shoot, I've had those last a full 4-hour game session. Why does this happen? I think that there are a few reasons. First, player and dungeon master turns just take a whole lot longer. There are more spells and abilities and options to consider, and adjudicating them takes longer. Next, hit point pools are much higher for both players and monsters. Now, you would think that it wouldn't matter because damage is also scaling, and yes it does, but not nearly as much as hit points do. The result is monsters that just take a long time to go down. Now, of course, we could just reduce hit points and increase damage to get the same challenge, and that's certainly a good option. And if you're a game master with enough spare time to homebrew every single monster or tweak the existing ones to do that, and enough experience to get the challenge level right, then knock yourself out. However, it begs the question, why don't the game designers just design monsters that way to begin with? Well, I'll tell you why. Because they know that players enjoy inflicting damage on the enemies, but that they do not enjoy taking damage. So, since one is more fun than the other, we get enemies that are big stacks of hit points and do less damage. The trade-off, of course, is that combats take a lot longer. It is an intentional game design decision. Number 7, characters get more complex. The higher level that characters become in level-based games like D&D, the more complicated they become. That means players have a lot more abilities to remember. They have more spells to learn or look up at the game table. Players have a lot more magic items, potions, and scrolls to keep track of. Character sheets can become more cluttered, and classes require a lot more going to the book. For clarification, even if a player has been playing a character from level 1, the plethora of abilities can make a character hard to play. This is even worse for high-level one-shots, or if a character dies and a new character joins that already has a sheet full of options. This high-level complexity is undesirable to some players and undoubtedly slows the game down, which could make it less exciting. Number 8. Math gets more complex. Math is the least popular subject in school, and as levels get higher, math becomes more complex. For instance, spells result in more dice rolled for damage, which requires more adding, which slows the game down if a player can't do fast math. A classic example is the rogue with 10d6 sneak attack damage who gets a critical hit. You'd be surprised at how long even a wizard upcasting magic missile can take to add up the damage. It's a noticeable bog on the game at times. Like I've literally waited like almost 2 minutes for a rogue who critical hitted with lots of dice to add them all up. It was a long time just to wait for them to add numbers together. I'm not saying I'm any better. I'm slow at it too. But then you need to consider that you have to add and subtract hit points, of course, slowing things a bit further. There is a reason I gave up keeping track of exact hit points on my monsters years ago. Now I track hit points in multiples of 10. It speeds up the game a lot. The easy solution is to shout, "Be smarter," or "learn to add." And I'm sure some of you are probably down in the comments right now leaving those nice comments. But the truth is that such talk just makes people who aren't that great at math feel worse and enjoy the math even less. Math is a genuine source of anxiety for a lot of people, and high-level play doesn't help with that. I've actually taken Calc 1, 2, and 3 and differential equations, and I had a 3.5 average across the board in them. So I'm actually really good at math, but I don't want to have to add and subtract crap at the game table because it slows things down. I actually had 4 points in Calc 1 and 2. And then for Calc 3, I was like, oh man, this 3D stuff is more complex. And I was like, either I'm gonna have a life or I'm gonna have a 4 point. And I chose to have a life. So I settled for a 3.5 in Calc 3. And then differential equations was a similar story. I was like, yeah, whatever. It's a 3.5 is still a pretty good grade. I'll be okay. Number 9, players get bored and want to play new characters. A lot of players believe that half the fun of RPGs is making new characters. D&D Beyond servers are loaded with characters that have never been played. I once had a player who wanted to change characters every game session. I crap you not. I had to make a rule that he couldn't change a character in the middle of an adventure. That's how bad it was. For many players, the longer a player lives in a character's skin, the more likely they are to get bored with it. Even our favorite TV shows get stale after a while, when it's the same thing week after week. Players want to try new things, and new ancestries and classes are a constant temptation, especially if they see another person playing an awesome class that they're interested in playing themselves. And the same can be said of game masters. Sometimes a campaign just gets dull, they become bored of it, and they want to do something new. Of course, this is not necessarily a failure of the game system itself, it's just one of those it is what it is situations, I guess. Number 10. The story reaches a logical conclusion and a new one is desired. If you're playing a campaign with a single big bad, with a beginning, middle, and end, a narrative game rather than a collection of unrelated adventures, eventually the story is going to come to a logical end. Players and game masters alike are rarely interested in playing a game past the end of the narrative, and very few games start a new story with high-level characters after the original story ends, though they absolutely could. However, it often doesn't feel natural, and it would probably be better to just start a new campaign with low-level characters instead. Now, what I'd like to know from you is whether or not you think Wizards of the Coast is going to fix any of these issues in the new edition they're releasing in 2024, or if we're going to be stuck with much of the same. Let me know down in the comments. Also, if you'd like to support the content my team and I create and pick up some fine Pathfinder 2 and D&D 5e resources you can use in your games, check out our Foundry VTT modules at the links below. Now, if you'd like to see my analysis of Pathfinder 2 versus D&D 5e and which is better, check out this video right here. And until next time, happy game mastering.